We'll switch over. The money man, Gary Sasse, is here, jingling with cash.
Is that right?
Yes, the money man has access to, knows everything. Janet Yellen's coming into town. Are you going to have any advice for her
No.
as well?
The only advice is be nice to the president so you can get reappointed.
Yes, that's right. Although the president's made some changes there. I don't want to lose the momentum. We just had former Governor Lincoln Chafee on, who this weekend once again got active on this issue of subsidies for corporate entities. Today over at Commerce, they're going to be voting on another bucket of money. I think it's around $13 million on today's vote at Commerce for the Wexford deal and the developer Galvin. Talk a little bit about your reaction first to, let's start with Governor Chafee's jumping into the fray on this.
Well, he's raised the right issue. You know, we look very closely at the tax incentives, and I think we should point out that not all tax incentives are created equally. One of the things the state has to do to compete is to try to create the most innovative and productive environment for business. And government has a role to play, not a major role, but in giving cluster grants and giving innovation grants and helping companies network. And so when you give tax incentives for innovation and for productivity, that's one thing. The other kinds of tax incentives, we have a quality jobs tax credit. And you have to look at that very closely. The question is, will the companies create those jobs without the credit? But that needs a different type of evaluation. And then we have real estate tax credits, which
Sure.
are Rebuild Rhode Island. And those are the most problematic.
So you're saying the rebuild ones raise the biggest questions for you as their effectiveness and whether that's good fiscal policy?
Yes, because the public has no sense of what the priority use of those dollars are, number one. So we look closely at it. You look at the rebuild credits, and we've used about 6% of the credits. We've probably just given out about $60 million in credits all told. We use about 6% for manufacturing and distribution. Well, if you're trying to create good middle-class jobs, it's manufacturing distribution.
Right.
On the other hand, we've given out over 9 cents on every dollar for hotels, apartment houses, office complexes. And you have to really raise a question. You have to ask the question, in 20 years, if I give a tax credit for a hotel, is it still going to be doing well? Why did the market support it? Is it going to be obsolete? I have too many rooms. But if you're giving tax credits, which I have problems with for things that produce traded industries,
Sure.
then there's a different kind of analysis. So I am very skeptical of what Commerce RI does because I've looked at where they're using the money. And that's to say nothing about, I'm trying to stay away from the ideological argument. I have real problems ideologically with corporate welfare and what's government's appropriate role, but I'm trying to stick to the basics. We have a program in place. Is it being used in the right way? Is it being done transparently? And I think there are too many questions right now.
Are they doing the proper analysis? If you're over at Commerce and you're directing that program, shouldn't you be looking for the kind of the biggest bang for the buck? And you know, hey, listen, an extended stay hotel is great to have in Providence. We can always use more hotel rooms.
Not 4 of them.
Whether we should fund 4 of them is certainly a question. And listen, everybody knows hotels are not the biggest job creators.
And they're not creating the kind of jobs that you're trying to create.
Yeah.
I'm not belittling the jobs they do create,
Correct.
but that's not the economic future of the state.
Right. Today they vote. There's some smart people on that board. You know, there were smart board members on economic development when they voted for 38 studios. What is it? Is it the culture? Is it afraid to ask questions? Is it I get appointed by the governor and the governor wants this? What's the breakdown?
I think the latter is a very good description. They're appointed by the governor. They want to be helpful to the governor.
Sure.
But this board, and I haven't been to their board meeting, so I'm saying this from 30,000 feet above. Seems to be a rubber stamp. You asked me the question earlier, are they doing their due diligence? I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they're being very transparent. And if you want to talk about the Wexford deal, there are a couple of very basic questions which I think are exemplary of my point. First question is, how many jobs are being created there? You know, you guys had a story several months ago saying they were phony numbers.
Yeah.
Well, now there are 700 jobs, but we find out 100 Brown had anyhow.
Yeah.
We find out that the Cambridge Innovation Center is not really jobs, but it's space for startups and high tech to get going. They may start there and then may end up in
Yep.
San Francisco. Who knows?
Right.
And so you don't have a very transparent jobs count. That's really a question. How many innovation centers does the state need? The voters of the state recently approved a $20 million bond issue
Sure.
for an innovation center affiliated with URI, the state's flagship university.
Well, we've got some organically grown ones, Founders Leagues here, and there's a private sector one that's just up the street. As I understand, neither of those two are full.
And so that's a question too, because, how many innovation centers, who's coordinating? And then the question of what is a subsidy? We were discussing this before. So we know they're going to get about a $19 million subsidy from 195 redevelopment monies. We know they're going to get a rebuild tax credit. We think that's in the $30 to $32 million range, probably more than that. But what they don't tell you is they're getting a sales tax exemption.
Right.
They don't have to pay sales tax on materials. When I build my little small store, I pay sales tax on the lumber and
Sure.
they got free land.
Yeah.
$4.5 million worth of free land.
And then a tax stabilization.
And it's a big tax stabilization.
Right.
So you look at a $105 to $150 million project, and you start adding these numbers up, and it is a tremendous subsidy, and it's a tremendous subsidy for the number of jobs that they're talking about creating. So that's a concern. Another concern is who's watching. So you have Commerce RI doing their job. I'm going to assume, given the benefit of the doubt, that they are doing their due diligence. They negotiated as well as they could negotiate on this deal. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't.
Sure.
But as you implement a project of this scope, of $100 to $150 million project, as you expect them to meet certain conditions, things change. Any business plan that's put in place, has to be flexible. Well, who's watching Commerce Rhode Island? Who's watching the guys that are in bed with Commerce Rhode Island? There doesn't seem to be, that going on because the board is a rubber stamp. And I did my friends, but they still are a rubber stamp.
Right.
The governor's the chairman of the board. They're
Right.
promoting these projects. We know, even with the best of intentions, things change, and you have to be flexible, but you have to be transparent in being flexible. So who is watching? Who is watching out for us in that? And I don't see anyone doing that. And those are the kinds of things, and we haven't even got into discussing the merits of that particular project and how there are merits and there are demerits.
So let me ask you two questions. First is, and I, plays devil advocate with former Governor Chafee and said, listen, the 195 land has been in development for almost 20 years. Governor Chafee's father, United States Senator John Chafee, got the initial federal funding to move 195. We're $800 million into this thing. Governor Raimondo comes in and sees that nothing's taken place, no development projects, and probably doesn't want to go through 4 years with nothing else and says, listen, I got to kickstart this thing. I got to get this thing going. I'm held responsible, and I need to get a deal going. How do you react to that?
There are two questions, and I appreciate the governor's position. So there's the question of what we do.
Right.
And the governor made a decision, and on paper, Wexford makes sense. Then there's the question, after the what question, which I would think you can defend, is the how question.
Right.
And the how question is what's causing everyone heartburn and problems, because we don't know what we're getting for our investment, we don't know how many jobs, we don't know how it coordinates with a $20 million bond issue that people pass for another innovation center. We haven't had a full disclosure on the amount of subsidies. So government has two responsibilities. The governor, any governor, has a responsibility to use that office as a bully pulpit to promote the state, and certainly that's a very valuable piece of property. But in doing that, how you do it becomes very important, because you could be spending more than you need. You could be spending money and have opportunity costs in the future. So the questions that I raise, there were two questions. I raised a philosophical question Why do you use, what is it, $40 or $50 million in taxpayer money, guarantee anchor tenants?
Yeah, that's right.
To a private developer? I mean,
One of them a nonprofit that's already here.
Yeah. So I wish somebody would give me that kind of a deal, where I develop a project, you give me a tax subsidy to do it, and you guarantee me anchor tenants. It's hard to be,
Right.
you have to be pretty stupid not to pull that off. And so there are all these how questions, and what type of due diligence has it gone through? Question I asked before is, it may seem trite, but it's a really important question. Who's going to watch?
Right.
You've instructed
Right.
Commerce Rhode Island to make the best possible deal. Well, they have a position. They're a partner to the deal. And so when you're speaking of $40 or $50 million in public monies, and you agree that we have to do something, I would disagree with using corporate welfare. I believe much more in markets, but that's a political decision that was made.
So let me ask you a question. If we want to borrow, if we want to issue a general obligation bond, our form of government requires that the voter approve $20 million to buy open space, right? And we're going to borrow that. It's going to be borrowed over time. In this situation, we're giving out, Commerce is giving out mammoth piles of money on some of these projects. 30, 40, $50 million. And there's no legislative approval for the individual project and no voter approval on the project.
And that gets to be a sticky wicket, because when you give a general obligation bond, the full faith and credit in the state is pledged. It used to be the case when you sold a revenue bond, the full faith and credit wasn't behind that bond. But after our experience with 38 Studios, when we thought we were selling moral obligation bonds, which are really actually one step down
under
the food chain,
GOs, revenue bonds, moral obligation bonds,
Yeah.
but we still backed it up with our full faith and credit.
Because the Wall Street interests beat up the taxpayer.
Yeah.
That's essentially what
Right.
What happened. So the distinction now that used to exist between revenue bonds and general obligation bonds and moral obligation bonds is less clear, because at the end of the day, the taxpayer's on the hook. And so you raise an important question, because maybe it's time to look at the constitutional provision and require voter approval for different types of any kind of debt, or more types of debt. The other question is a tougher question. You say without legislative approval, and I look at it both ways. One way it would be good to have legislative approval. On the other way, I'd really be very careful of getting the legislature involved in negotiations.
Too much deal making. If Governor Raimondo wants this for Wexford, she's got to give us this for.
Or if you want to do this project, you have to use my buddy as a carpenter.
Yeah.
You have that situation, how that plays out sometime. And so I think the fair question you ask is, what kind of debt should the state assume if implicitly the full faith and credit is going to be behind the debt? And I think that question is, 38 Studios really raised that question, but everyone's ducking that question right now.
Right. I want to thank you very much for coming on in. Appreciate the perspective, especially. You're not going to be here next week.
No.
We're going to still conduct the interview. We're going to pile up gold bullion to replicate the money man.
Well, just give me my cut.
Just give you your cut. Are you in D.C.?
Yes.
Yes, and under secret orders from high-powered.
What you do in Vegas stays in Vegas.
What you do in Washington stays in Washington.